Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Lleu. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to finish up our little quadrilogy or tetralogy here about the Mabinogi. So this fourth branch that we're going to talk about today seems to take place shortly after the third branch. So right after the enchantment is lifted off of Dafed, that seems to be where we're at. And I say that because we're going to see Pryderi here, who's ruling over Dafed, and there's no enchantment over the land. Like, everything is restored. And at the start of this fourth branch, we're introduced to a character called Math, who is the Lord of Gwynedd in northwest Wales. And we learn a certain thing about this Lord, about Math. We learn that he has to have his feet enfolded in the lap of a maiden at all times, unless he is going to war. And the name of his foot holder is a lady named Gwyn. And in the actual history of Wales, you can see that this role of foot holder was an actual position. But what makes it interesting with regards to the story is that the foot holder very clearly was a male. But here we're told it has to be a virgin woman. And Freudians have had quite a field day trying to interpret this, right? Like this idea that this king, he's unable to do anything outside the lap of this virgin, except when he goes to war. There's all sort of weird, psychosexual, mother figures and, things like that going on that people have tried to interpret. But I think that, frankly, that there's a much easier answer when looking at the Mabinogi as a sort of a Christian text, or at the very least, written by Christians in a very Christian society. At this point, Wales has been thoroughly Christianized for, several hundred years, probably 500 years or so at this point. So to me, when I first heard of this image, or I first read about this, it reminded me of when you look at an icon of the Mother of God with Jesus as a child, right? You see Jesus, you see the Virgin Mary holding Jesus, and Jesus's feet are often literally in her lap. And I've found some iconography from Wales, from archaeology stuff, where you see this icon. It's very common in the East, as well as in the Old West as well. Even still today in the West, you'll see this sort of imagery. However, typically they like to portray Mary just by herself, which is rather rare in the Eastern tradition at least. But there's a problem that it's kind of hard to determine how popular this sort of image would have been in medieval Wales, partly because of during the Reformation in England, so much of the iconography was destroyed, or the churches in general were destroyed, monasteries destroyed or repurposed, as well as there's just the issue that Wales is a very damp and humid place. And because of that, frescoes aren't going to last that long. So there's a sort of just preservation issue on top of a intentional mass destruction that happened, which makes finding any sort of image or iconography in Wales very difficult. But despite all this, the intentional destruction and just the, a bad place for preservation for, hundreds of years or even 1,000 years, we can find some of these images. And then if you remember what I spoke about in the first branch about what the word Mabinogi means, it means acts related to the divine child or a divine child. And specifically the word Mabinogi, it's a rather rare word, but one of the instances in which we see it used is the title of a work about the Jesus as a child. So I'm not 100% sure about this interpretation, but I think there's a lot of weight to my interpretation. Regardless, though, the fact that he has to have his feet in the lap of this virgin at all times unless he's going to war causes a lot of issues. So one of them is that he can't really rule his kingdom as effectively. So he has to delegate the task of, circuiting his kingdom, or going around and doing everything a lord is supposed to do, going around to various villages, probably administering local justice, hearing cases, things like that. He has to delegate that to his nephews. And the names of his two nephews are Gilfoethwy and Gwydion. And here I'm really butchering the names of the pronunciation. I really try to figure out how to pronounce these names, and Just the problem is that some of the sounds that Welsh uses just don't really exist in English, so it's really hard for me to always pronounce them. So sorry about the pronunciation. But one of his nephews, Lleu, he sets his eyes on the Virgin. He has lustful eyes towards her, shall we say. And so him and his brother, they concoct this plan in order to carry out their desires. So they tell Math about these pigs, these animals that they've never seen before on the island, that Pryderi, who's in the south, ruling in the south, has obtained from Anwen by Arun. So if you remember, Arun is sort of the realm of the other world, or it's one of the kingdoms of the other world that Pryderi went to kind of do a task that we learned about in the first branch. And Arun is the king of Anwen. And I think I misspoke. It wasn't Pryderi who went to the other world. It was his father, Pwyll, who went to the other world. But Pryderi is continuing those good relationships that his father established with the other world. And then from the second branch, we also learned that there was swine herds over in Ireland. But the pigs are rather new to Wales. So Math hears them out and he says, okay, go concoct your plan to try and, get some of these pigs. So Lleu and Gwydion, they disguise themselves as these bards. And then they go to the court of Pryderi, and they basically they put on a show, they entertain the court and all that. And then after they're done, Pryderi, he enjoyed it so much that he asked if there's anything that he can give them, something in return. And they say that they want the pigs. But Pryderi tells them that he can't. He says, look, man, I can't because I agreed that I will not let them leave like, his kingdom until they've doubled in size. So then the brothers kind of go away and then they conjure with magic. And it's very explicit that they're using magic. And it even says that they use like toadstool. They conjure up these 12 horses with saddles, 12 greyhounds, 12 golden shields. And then they present them to Pryderi and they say that, look, you can exchange the pigs for something better, and then it wouldn't violate your agreement that you have with the other world. And then Pryderi agrees, even though in reality this is a breaking of the bond or the promise that he made to Arun. And then once they get the pigs, they quickly run away and they leave. And then because of the conjuration that they used as magic, and it's not like the real thing, all the stuff that they gave Pryderi disappears. And obviously Pryderi is very upset. And then once he realizes that these men come from Math's kingdom, he goes and summons his men and starts to attack Math and his kingdom. And since now Math has to go to war, he can leave the lap of the Virgin and he can go out and fight. And once Math leaves, Lleu, he finds the Virgin Gowen and then he rapes her. The nephews then return to the front where the fighting is happening. And then after some fighting between Pryderi and Math and their armies, they agree that they'll settle the battle or settle the war with a duel. So Pryderi duels against Gwydion. And this is a common thing that you see not only in medieval warfare, but even in ancient warfare. Like if you go back to your Bible and you look at the story of David and Goliath, that's kind of what happened, right? They're fighting, and then they say, look, we'll just both send out one champion, and then whoever wins, that will be the winner, and then we'll settle it from there. That way we can avoid all this, more destruction or unnecessary casualties and all that. So Gwydion goes out to fight Pryderi, but then Pryderi is killed by Gwydion in the fight. And we're told that he wins with strength, valor, aggression, magic, and enchantment. And the implication here is that Pryderi loses because he broke his promise with the other world. He no longer has good relationships with the other world, and therefore there are certain consequences. In this case, it is his death. So after the fighting is all done, Math goes back to his castle or back to his kingdom, and then he meets Gowen, and then he tries to put his feet in her lap or whatever, and then she says, "I am no longer a virgin. I am now like a lady." And then he's like, "What? Who did this to you?" And then she reveals everything that happened. And so Math then marries Gowen, not because of like some romantic attraction or anything like that. Rather, it's more so out of like societal protection, because she is now a married woman. She has a certain status in society that she wouldn't have been able to have as a non-virgin single woman. And again, this is another common thing that you kind of see in the medieval and ancient world. Going back to the Bible again, this is, for instance, kind of what happened with Joseph and Mary, where Joseph, as an older man, marries this single woman in order to give her a certain societal protection in society. And then you even see this if you read the book of Esther in the Septuagint translation and the Greek translation, where it says that Mordecai marries Esther for like a similar purpose. And Mordecai is also this older man who marries Esther, who is a virgin. He then summons his nephews, and then he enacts a punishment on them in order to achieve justice. So Math is also a sort of like a magician, and he has like a wand that he uses. And then he transforms them into a hind and a stag, so like a male and female deer. And he says that they're to mate together and to return in 1 year. And then he turns them into other animals as well. So there's a pattern that happens where he turns one into a male, the other into a female, says they are to mate and come back in 1 year. And when they do, they come back with their offspring, the animal offspring. And then Math turns the animal offspring into a human. It's like a human baby. And then he baptizes the baby and raises him as his own. And then he turns them into other animals. So he turns them into the deer, and then into hogs, and then into wolves. And then he gets the 3 children, and we're told that each time he gets the children, he baptizes them as well. So after they come back as animals for the 3rd time, the poem, or rather the story says, at that he struck both of them with the magic wand, returning them back to their own flesh. Men, he said, for the injury you inflicted on me, you have had enough punishment. You have incurred great shame, each of you having borne children from the other. Prepare a bath and wash their heads and have them arrayed. And that was done for them. So after 3 times, he says, okay, look, enough of the punishment. I'm now going to turn you into humans, and this should be a sufficient punishment. And then he has them bathe to sort of like reintroduce them into the human world. And we also saw this instance of sort of this ritual bathing after some form of humiliation when it came to the first branch after the whole badger in the bag incident, where Rhianwan's suitor was put into this bag and just beaten by the people who are walking by. After it's all said and done, he then goes and bathes as a sort of a way to I guess you could say reintroduce yourself back into like society. So he then reconciles with Gwydion and Gilfoethwy, but interestingly, we never see Gilfoethwy again. We only see Gwydion. And this is a common medieval trope, sort of, where you have this doubling motif. And the idea is that really they're like one person, but there's these 2 aspects of the person that are being personified. There's like the evil side and then the good side. And then after this punishment, we only see a Gwydion, who I guess is to represent the better side of the man, we could say. But don't take the whole like 2 aspects too seriously, or too literally rather, like too materialistically, because obviously they were 2 people. That's how they were able to have intercourse as animals and all that. But there is this sense in which they are sort of one, and they are brothers, for instance. And we actually saw this a little bit with Nisan and Efnisan back in the 2nd branch, where they're also brothers. But one represents the evil side and one represents the good side. But after a while, we only see the bad one appear in the story. So in this case, we only see the good one appear in the story afterwards. Even though they're both sort of evil at first, right? Like they both sort of are implicit in the rape of Gawain, even though it was Gilfoethwy that actually did it. If you read the story, it sort of implies that when they were doing the action, that both of them were at least somewhat involved. It's not too clear, it's kind of vague. But either way, we can move on. So the next episode is that Math then tries to marry. He tries to find someone for him to marry. And this kind of suggests as well that his marriage with Gawain was really just one of protection and not one where they had any like relations necessarily. So he tries to marry his niece. And then he tests her virginity by having her step over this magic wand that he has. So she says that she's a virgin, but then he says, okay, let's see. So she steps over the wand, and then once she does that, a boy, like a baby boy, drops from under her, revealing that she's not a virgin. And then Math raises that child as well, and then as well, baptism also takes place. But not only a baby boy drops out, but also the poem is very vague here, but it says she also dropped a little something. That's at least the translation that I'm using. That's what it says. And in the footnote of that sentence, the translator is saying that, yeah, this is like a very vague term. It's not too clear what this is. The translator's suggestion is that it might be some form of like afterbirth, but again, it's really not clear. But either way, Gwydion, he picks it up, whatever it is, and he wraps it in brocaded silk. And if you remember, like I've said a lot of times now, but brocaded silk indicates the other world, or it has like some sort of symbolism to the other world. And then Gwydion then places it in a chest in his room, and then after some time, it comes out as a child. So I think that the thing that she drops might be some form of like fetus, like a very small fetus, like first trimester or something. And then the chest serves as a sort of like artificial womb, or external womb, you could say. And then after a while, it develops into a child. He then gives it to a wet nurse to raise in the early infancy, but then he raises the child as his own. And it says that he very much loved the child, and that the child grew up very quickly. And after a couple of years, Gwydion takes the child back to Math's niece, and her name, by the way, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like Aranthod. It's spelled Aranrhod. So he presents the child and he says, like, look, this is your child. And then she gets very mad. She's like, why would you bring this shame upon me? She kind of goes off on him. And then she asks what the name of the boy is. And then he says, there's no name upon him yet. And then she says, I will swear an oath upon him. He will not get a name until he gets it from me. And the implication is that she's never going to name the boy. And then Gwydion says, I swear to God by my confession, you are a wretched woman. The boy will get a name, even if it is evil to you. And you, he continued, because of him, grief is upon you. You are not called a maiden, and will never be called a maiden again. And then here, the poem stops referring to the boy as just like the boy, and then it becomes more specific, and it says that it is his boy, indicating that Gwydion is taking a sort of ownership or fatherhood over this boy. And in some way, we might see this as a sort of repentance that he is doing for, assisting or being complicit in the rape of Gawain. But, he concocts a plan in order to name the boy. So he dresses up, or rather he uses magic and conjures himself up as a sort of merchant. But not just him, he also does the boy as well, making him like his assistant. And more specifically, they're like these traveling cobblers, these traveling shoemakers. They then go to Aranthod's court, and then they're able to kind of get her to come out to, measure her shoes and all that. And then while he's measuring her foot size, the child takes a stone and then throws it at a bird, and kind of hits it, very skillfully. And then she exclaims, it's okay. And there's like a pretty difficult linguistic pun, but essentially she inadvertently names the boy, and the name is going to be, and again, this name is very hard to pronounce. It's Lleu, which is something like Lleu, but even then, I don't think I got it right. So just part of my pronunciation. But anyways, she inadvertently names the boy, and then Gwydion reveals the ruse that he pulled on her. And then, in a fury, she says that the boy will never bear arms until she herself gives them to him. And then once the boy comes of age, in terms of, it's the time for him to start practicing with weapons and to bearing arms, he concocts another plan. So he uses magic again, and he disguises him and the boy as these traveling bards, and they go to Aranthod's court again. And then after they're entertaining the court, he then conjures up these ships, at least the appearance of these ships outside of the court that they're at, as if they're being under attack. And then the court goes into, all hands on deck mode and starts equipping everyone for defense. And they even start equipping the bards. They say, or rather the bards say, look, we can fight too. So they then give them arms and weapons. And then he reveals that it was all a ruse again. And then Aranthod is again very mad that she was yet again tricked. And then she curses Lleu yet again, and she says that the boy will never get a wife, period. And then so they go back, and then once the boy grows up, we're told that he's very handsome, very attractive, very strong, and that it's time for him to find a wife. But there's that curse that Aranthod placed onto him. And then he then goes to Math. So Gwydion goes to Math, and he tells him what has happened and how the boy's unable to get a wife because of the curse and all that. And then Math and Gwydion both use their magic in conjunction together to create a wife for him. I'll read the description of what happened here. It says, "Then they took the flowers of the oak, the flowers of the broom, and the flowers of the meadowsweet. And from those they called forth the fairest and most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. She was baptized with the baptism they practiced back then, and the name Lleu was put upon her. And that name, Lleu, just means like flowers. So they then get married, and then Math gives Lleu some land to rule with his wife. And then after some time passes, Lleu is out of his kingdom. He's out visiting someone, and Lleu is by herself in the court. And then there's a hunter who's hunting in their land. He's like a nobleman of some sort. And then she invites him in order to show hospitality. Lleu looked upon him, and in the instant she looked, there was not an emotion within her that wasn't filled with love for him. And he also gazed at her, and the same thought came to him as had come to her. He was not able to hide that he was in love with her, and told her so, and she took great pleasure at that. And because of the passion and love each felt for the other, that was all they talked about that night. Nor did they wait any longer than that night before they embraced one another, and then were told that night that they slept together. They then concoct a plan in order to kill Lleu, so that they can be together. And the hunter, whose name is Gronu, says that she needs to find out how to kill Lleu, because he's a very hard man to kill, and there must be a certain way that he can be killed. And he says that she should use so-called affectionate nagging in order to find out. So we see a little bit of a repeat of what happened with Gawain, or at least in the sense that there was some sort of illicit sexual actions going on that have a real opportunity to upset the land due to the weird relations that it's going to create and the sort of evil that you invite when you do such things. So anyways, when Lleu comes back, Lleu says to him, she says, "I've been thinking something you wouldn't think about me. It's just," she continued, "that I've been worried about your death if you go before me." "Aye," said he, "God repay your care. But unless God kills me, however, it is not easy to kill me. Will you, for God's sake and mine, tell me by what means you might be killed, since my memory is a better safeguard than yours?" "I'll tell you gladly," Lleu says. "It is not easy to kill me by a blow. It would be necessary to spend a year making the spear to strike me with, and without making any of it except when one was at Mass on Sundays." And then there's a bit more that he goes into describing how he has to be killed with that spear that's made only on Sundays for a whole year. And then he has to be stabbed when he's standing in a certain position next to a certain bath. So Lleu sends a message to Gronu telling him to start crafting the spear. And then after a year to rendezvous back. And then she'll get ready to make sure that he's in the position so that he can be killed. So after this year, basically, Lleu convinces Lleu to take the bath and stand in the position where he could be killed at. And all this is kind of under the guise of, well, I just want to know so that it never happens. I just need to see so that, the situation never occurs. And then Lleu, is more than willing, and he does it. And then once he's standing in the position where his legs are spread out, and he has one foot on the bath and the other on this animal. And then once he's in the position, then Granu, who's watching this whole thing, once he's in position, he then throws the spear at him. And it's mentioned that it's actually a poison spear. So we saw a poison spear earlier at the end of the second branch, which is the spear that stabs who, if you remember, was the High King of Britain, or the Island of the Mighty. And then during that episode of the second branch, I talked about how there's the implication, or there's at least a way people have interpreted this story in the medieval world, was that they saw this as a form of castration, or rather like a euphemism for castration. And we have a similar thing happening here as well, right? Where it seems to imply that some form of castration took place, or at least an attempt of castration took place. And this is especially relevant because, he's naked, or at least he has a towel on him, and his legs are spread apart, as well as this has to do with this sort of sexual usurpation. So it's not too far of a stretch to say that this might be some form of castration. So when the spear hits him, we're told that Lleu took flight in the form of an eagle and gave a terrible scream. And after that, they lost sight of him. Lleu and Granu, then after Lleu turns into an eagle and runs away, they then go back to their land, and they combine both of the lands together. And it should be noted, I think I forgot to mention it, but Gronw, his land is in southeast Wales, whereas the place where Blodeuwedd is at is in northwest Wales. Eventually, Gwydion gets the news of what has happened to his son, or his nephew, or his boy. Those terms are all used interchangeably here. And then he goes out looking for him. And then after searching in the place where Gwydion fought Pryderi, where he killed him, he eventually finds his nephew in an oak tree. And then he sort of sings this song, and then he comes down, and he's still in the form of an eagle, by the way. And we're told that there's like pigs underneath the tree that are eating the maggots that are falling down, and the maggots in the flesh that are falling down from the tree, which are coming from Lleu. So he calls him down, and then he hits him with the magic wand, and he transforms him back into a human, and he's in a totally wretched state. And then after a year of resting, he's finally back to full health. And then he asks Math if he can help him enact justice against Blodeuwedd and Gronw. And then he agrees, of course, and then he sends men to help him fight. So Gwydion, Lleu, and all the men go over to his kingdom, or his former, kingdom. And then Gwydion runs upon Blodeuwedd, and then he says to her, "I will not kill you. What I'm going to do is even worse. That is, I will release you into the shape of a bird, because of the shame that you have wrought upon Lleu. You will not dare to show your face ever again in the light of day, and that will be because of enmity between you and all other birds. It will be in their nature to harass you. Wherever you are, they will find you, and you will not lose your name. That will always be Blodeuwedd." I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, but essentially they're changing the name from flowers to owl, but the names they sound very similar. And then the story goes on to say that because of this is the reason why there's still hostility between birds and owls. Meanwhile, Gronw sends out a message, and he says that he doesn't want to fight, and that he'll give any sort of land or gold or silver that he needs to do to pay the blood price. That is, he understands that there's a feud that has occurred that he has caused, and that he can solve it through a sort of monetary value. And we saw this a couple other times in the story, or at least this notion of a blood payment or a blood price pops up. But Lleu says that he doesn't want any of those things. Instead, he wants to cast a spear at him where he had originally thrown it in the first place, and then he agrees to this. So they go to the place where Gronw first threw the spear, and then Gronw essentially takes the place of Lleu when he originally threw it. But before the spear is thrown, Gronw asks whether or not he can place a rock between him and Lleu. And Lleu agrees to this. And Gronw is very, he's very happy. He says, "Thank you so much. You're so generous." But then when Lleu throws the spear, it pierces the rock and makes a hole into it, and then it stabs him and kills him. Lleu then takes back his rule, this time as a single man, and in a sense, we're kind of how we were at the very beginning of the first branch of the Mabinogi. That is, we again have this bachelor lord. And now that's the end of the story. That's the end of the fourth branch, and that's the end of all the branches of the Mabinogi. But before we end, I do want to talk a little bit about the branches as a whole and all these stories together. So if you want to make the argument that this is some veiled mythology of some sort and it's secretly pagan, that's going to be very hard to make. Maybe you could say that there's elements of it, or maybe some certain names and themes, and maybe some certain peculiarities and characteristics of various so-called euhemerized gods. But if you look at the morals of the story, that's kind of hard to maintain. Let's look at the end of the fourth branch here. We have a clear repudiation of this sort of pagan succession myth of this sexual usurpation. And we're told that, no, actually it's really bad when you do that. And you actually deserve to die, right? It's not seen as a good thing, right? Gronw at the very end, he essentially recognizes that it is just what is happening to him. And he understands that this is the natural consequences of his actions. I don't normally do this, but there is an interesting article that I found by a Father Paul Sewers, and when I read the article, I didn't realize he was an Orthodox priest. But as I was reading, I was like, man, this guy sure knows a lot about like Orthodox stuff and Orthodox theology in a way that like most people, especially most scholars, don't know about. Then I looked him up, and apparently he's a priest. So we have this Father Paul here, and his last name is Siewers. I guess it's Sewers, not too sure, but I'll just call him Father Paul. So Father Paul has an article, and I'll link it in the description and whatnot, and he talks about the Mabinogi, and his views on it are actually quite similar to mine, in that he doesn't see it so much as preserving pagan mythology, but as an older pre-Norman Celtic Christianity that is being preserved against the backdrop of like the Norman invasion, Norman conquest, and as well as the general trend of like Romanization that was going along in the Latin West at the time. And when I say Romanization, I don't mean like necessarily the Empire of Rome, but rather like the ecclesiastic aspect of like the papacy. It was very monastic based in terms of a lot of the priests and a lot of the bishops especially all came from the monasteries, and the centers of religious life often revolved around a monastery. And there was a lot of tension between the Romans, like the papacy, and like the sort of more indigenous Celtic Christian traditions. I think I mentioned it sometime in another episode, but one of the big things was over tantraship, like how do you cut a monk's hair and the initiation into being a monk. Like that was a really big issue of contention, as well as things about like baptism, like what's the right form of baptism. You know, we totally don't have that happening today. But it was just much different than what Rome was trying to prescribe across the West. And then another interesting point that he makes is the way that he views all four of these branches together. So he relates this to St. Gregory the Theologian, and how St. Gregory comments on a passage in Ezekiel, so specifically Ezekiel 1:10, and it's his visions that he has of like these angels that have these four faces. Like one side's a lion, another has the face of a man, and one of an ox, and then one of an eagle. So these four figures of what's called in Greek like the tetramorph have always been identified as one of the Gospels. So normally, or almost universally, the eagle is the Gospel of St. John, and then the lion, the man, and the ox are variously attributed to either Matthew, Luke, or Mark. And it kind of just varies on the church father and tradition according to which one is attributed to which one. But this wasn't at all uncommon in the West. Like, if you read Libanus's commentary on Revelation in around like the 800s in Spain, he quotes this part of St. Gregory's commentary on Ezekiel. And then he relates it to the book of Revelation in some interesting ways. Maybe we'll get into that one day. But regardless, Father Paul makes the case that each of these branches relates to one of the faces of the tetramorph. So it's pretty obvious that this last branch that involves Lleu is related to the eagle that soars above, right? And then another important aspect of the vision of Ezekiel is we're given sort of directions. So we're told that the face of the eagle is above them all, and then the ox is on the left side, and then the man and the lion are on the right side. And in medieval and like ancient cosmology, orientation is always towards the east. Quite literally, the word orientation comes like from the word orient, which means the east, like facing east, in the same way that Christians in church always stand and pray facing east, right? So the right side is going to be the south, and the left is going to be the north. So there's the eagle that's above it all, then there's two on the right, so the south, and then there's one on the left, up north. And then it so happens that the one story that takes place primarily in the north, at least North Wales, is the second branch of the Mabinogi with Bron. And he relates Bron to the ox, and the ox is the one that's in the north, that's on the left side, by the way. And this makes sense for a couple of reasons. So the ox is like a beast of burden. And we see Bron as this big beast of burden as well. Like quite literally, he carries all the people, or at least all the minstrels, on his back as he wades across over to Ireland. And then we see him become the bridge that people walk across. And then as well, this idea of the ox. So you have to remember, ox isn't a species. It's a sort of it's a type of like bovine that has been castrated. And this is done so that the animal isn't so hostile, it isn't so aggressive, just because it has lower testosterone, so it's easier to work with. And then if you remember what I said about how Bronn, there's a euphemism for castration that is implied when he's stabbed with a poison spear in his foot. So all of that kind of holds up. And then we have these two other ones. So we have the man, and then we have the lion. And both of those are on the right, so in the south. And then he relates the man with Pryderi, because his father is Poil, who's like a man, but then his mother is Ranwan, and Ranwan is this like otherworldly figure. She's like from the other world quite explicitly. So it's the man in the sense that like the divine man, and that's what the Mabinogi kind of means, right? Like the acts of the divine child or something like that. And we see in the figure of Pryderi, we see, he's kind of the combination, or the combination between the other world and the human world in one person, combined in one person. And then lastly, we have Manawithon, or the third branch of the Mabinogi, and he's related to the lion, because if you remember, there's the last kind of like third or so of the story there is about how he's trying to kill this mice, how he catches mice, and that's what a lion as a cat does. Oh, and something I forgot to mention regarding Bronn and the ox is that the ox in the Bible is a sacrificial animal, and at the end, Bronn sacrifices himself by having his head chopped off, and then they place it, or they bury it in London in order to ward off enemies, as like sort of like relic, you could say. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but it's really interesting, and I like to think it's true because I think it's really cool. I don't know if it's exactly 100% correct, but I think there might be something here, and I just wanted to share that with y'all. And now I want to go back to something I talked about in the very beginning of this series, with the first branch of the Mabinogi, which is what is the exact setting or the time place of this story. Because part of the problem that we have is that there's a lot of what we might call anachronisms, right? Like if we're to think that this story takes place long, long ago, back before Christianity was introduced into Wales, then there's a problem in the fact that we have, mentions of a mass, we have bishops, we have priests, we have baptisms, we have people talking about God, and talking about the Son of God too, etc., etc. But the issue is that doesn't really help us place this story at all, because medieval literature has absolutely no problem with anachronism. Like I've read these morality plays where you have like stories of the Bible being enacted in a sort of play form or a theatrical form. And then one of them was about, I remember it was about Noah and the ark. And then in the story, Noah, he says something like, by the Saints Peter and Paul, da-da-da-da-da-da. So, Noah, who's this, figure from the time of the flood, is invoking Saints Peter and Paul. Clearly an anachronism, but no one has any issue with that. And another big anachronism, which I talked about, is if this is supposed to be in a very, very old time, is that London exists. And London did not exist until the Romans built it. Like everyone knew that back in the day. So if we're going to try to place the setting of the story, we can't rely off, so-called like historical details that are added in here. We have to go on a more symbolic route. So one of the things that we can rely on, I think, is that the fact that there's like some antediluvian theme, sort of, right? So we're told that the water between Ireland and Wales wasn't so deep at that time, as if like the flood hadn't come yet. As well as we have Bronn, who's this giant, just hanging out in the world, which, I mean, you could say that adds to the point of this being an older story. However, like the Book of Enoch was like going around a lot during the Celtic world at this time, even though it was banned by Pope Gelasius I. Anyways, the Celtic monasteries were just still copying that down, and it influences a lot of actually Anglo-Saxon literature as well, Like I talked about this in the story of Saint Guthlic. And the reason why this is an issue I bring up is because the Book of Enoch talks about how giants could come about after the flood. But then the other thing that does make me think that this is supposed to be an older setting is that there's magic. Like there's like magic wands and stuff like that, as if it's some sort of like pagan practice, or maybe not necessarily pagan practice per se, but how Christians in the medieval era would have saw older pagan practices as being. But I think an even better explanation is that this isn't supposed to be strictly in the historical past. So we can look at genre. So in terms of genre, this is not a chronicle. Medieval and ancient people, they had a specific genre in which, if they wanted to do more like literal history, so to speak, there was a way in which they did it. And this is not it. This is not a chronicle. This is not a history, right? This is something else. This is a more poetic work, literature. And throughout, there's a couple times we see a phrase that it's kind of hard to translate, but the best translation would be something like "once upon a time." So I don't think this is literally supposed to be set in some specific time period. And that's why anachronisms are more than okay in the story. And there's like Christianity, but there's also these like pagan elements sort of with like magic and wands and whatnot. Of course, obviously as Christians, we believe that there's magic and that people can use wands and other things to help them with their help them with their magic and, turn people into animals and all that. But it's more so that people who are Christians, which these characters aren't the ones who should be doing that, right? Like we understand that those two don't go hand in hand. Like, divination and magic aren't things Christians are supposed to do. So one way you could see this story would be talking about noble pagans of some sort, right? Like, oh, these are our ancestors. This is a Welsh work written in Welsh about the Welsh people. So you could say that it's supposed to say, look, these are our ancestors, and although they engaged in magic and stuff, not everything is bad about it, and there's certain things we can salvage and maybe rewrite a little bit, and that's okay, because people understood when you do a work like this, you're not being strictly historical or strictly, materialistic about it. But either way, at a meta level, I think that all these stories are trying to do, I guess we could say maybe two main things. So one is provide some sort of unification myth for the Welsh people during the Norman invasion. So we know that this was written, no matter if you take an earlier view or a later view, regardless, it's written during the Norman invasion. And it's supposed to be a unification myth. But maybe this seems weird, right? Because if you look at the antagonists in this story, they're almost all Welsh. Like there's some Irish, but they're mostly all Welsh. If you were just writing, like, at least in the modern world, if you're writing like propaganda, you want your enemy in your story to be a clear analogy to the real life enemy, right? But we don't really see that. Like there's not really like Normans or anything that could resemble Normans aren't really mentioned at all. The only thing I could possibly see would be the merchants over in England that are talked about, but they play a relatively minor role in the whole story. But I think that's because medieval so-called propaganda is a bit more nuanced than, the 20th century gave us. So if you look at one of the previous episodes that we did on Digeni Zakritas, we see that it is also like ostensibly some form of like Byzantine propaganda during the time of like the reconquest of Eastern Anatolia. But all of the bad guys are these like Christians from Anatolia itself. They're not like Muslims or Saracens or Arabs or anything. In fact, when we do meet some Syrians, all the Syrians are like the good guys. Like they're the ones who convert to Christianity. They do what is right. But the bad guys are all, people from within Byzantium. The story more so is trying to establish a historical claim to Eastern Anatolia rather than demonize the enemy per se. And I think a similar thing is going on here, where it's not so much trying to demonize the Normans. I mean, maybe implicitly you could argue, but it's not very explicit. And if they're trying to demonize the Normans, they're doing a pretty bad job because most of the bad guys come from Wales in the story. It's more so trying to say that Wales itself has a history. Like, and we saw throughout, and I mentioned throughout, that the landscape itself is sort of like the main character. Like, we see the land playing a pretty large role. I didn't mention everything because sometimes it's in these really weird details that it would take me like a long time to explain all the context and nuance with. But we see the land of Wales itself kind of being the main character, and things happen through the landscape, and things affect the landscape, and things like fertility of the land play a huge role as well. So it's acting as a sort of cultural front, I guess you could say, to the Norman invasion, and saying, look, Normans, or look, conquerors, whatever, we have our own long history. We have our own long attachment to the land that dates all the way back to this, prehistorical and mythical time, where even then they were like sort of, Christians or good pagans, whatever you want to say. Like, look, we have this giant Bronn, but he's actually like a good guy. He's not like one of the bad giants, right? I think that's probably the best way you can view this poem. There's just a lot of nonsense out there, frankly, where all these people, they want to view this poem in the terms of like mythography or history, trying to see, okay, what little secrets were left in by the editing process that we in the 20th century or 21st century can figure out that the scribes must have accidentally just slipped in. Like, maybe there's a little bit of that, but I think that there's a much better way to view this story as a fundamentally Christian story that is trying to act as a sort of like a cultural preservation for Wales, I guess you could say. Trying to say that, look, Wales has been part of the Christian story for a long time. This is our history. This is our people. In a sense, this is even our genealogy, while talking about some very real themes that we saw throughout, right? Like dangers of sexuality, right rule, a good relation with the other world, which you could see is talked about as the other world in this mythical past, but easily could relate to like the spiritual world. Like, you need a good relation to the spiritual world, and the spiritual world isn't just over there and we're here. Rather, the two things are very connected with each other. Anyways, that's all I had. I've been going on for quite a while. Thank you so much for listening. We'll shift gears in our next episode. Thank you so much.